As Canadians, the human rights abuses that we carry out are usually overlooked in favor of the ones made by the United States because they're larger and part of relatively the same group. So people tend to focus on them and not us. However, this new report by the UN by several countries implicates us and shows us the human rights abuses that we as Canadians actually carry out. Many of those countries were in fact Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and Pakistan. In fact, the DPRK's main criticism about Canada was our shaky commitment to freedom of speech. We have serious concerns about the continued violations of the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression, torture and other ill treatment, racism, and xenophobia. Now, this criticism is legitimate. It was only a few days ago that 450 people were arrested in Montreal for demonstrating against the government. There was a protest, they were kettled, and 450 people were arrested. In fact, footage has even been released of people being randomly arrested by police, even though seemingly not a part of the protest, but either on their way to or home from work. There have been 1,200 arrests in 2 months. That means well over 5,000 people have been illegally detained since 2012. Iran, too, expressed its concern over Canadian policy. Violations of human rights by the Canadian government, including child sexual exploitation and trafficking, the right to food, discriminatory law and regulation against Indigenous people and minority groups, including Muslim, Arab, and African communities. Some of the criticisms by other countries included China complaining about Canada's widespread racial discrimination in Canada. Pakistan was dismayed by Canada's increased poverty and unemployment rate among immigrant communities. Egypt, Canada's racial profiling and law enforcement action, and Cuba with their racism and xenophobia in Canada. Russia expressed alarm over Canada's police actions of torture and cruelty against peaceful demonstrators. In fact, it was around this time last year that a UN representative was in Canada and accused the Canadian government of allowing many people to go malnourished, some to even starve.
And today we have a large number of Canadians who are unacceptably too poor to feed themselves decently. More than 800,000 households who are considered food insecure, representing between 2 and 3 million individuals, and that we have close to 900,000 people depending on food bank. I am struck by the desperate situation in which many find themselves. Often huge communities depend for 85% of their members on social assistance in order not to fall in food insecurity.
Now, what's our excuse? Why do we have this in Canada? We're a first world industrialized nation. Places like North Korea, for example, have sanctions placed on them from purchasing the amount of food that they actually need. We have no such restrictions. So why do we have any of this? Why do we have these problems with not having enough healthy food to get to people? Even North Korea can still manage to avoid whatever it can with the very limited resources and deliberate blocks against them from purchasing the amount of food that they actually need. So what's Canada's excuse? Well, we do know that it's largely going ignored, or almost completely ignored, because the overwhelming majority of the people who suffer from this food insecurity are First Nations people. Now, of course, Canada did respond to these accusations, or rather pointing out of facts, but they did so in a very weak way. The best any Canadian politician was able to do was make an appeal to hypocrisy and say that the places attacking them were worse, which therefore means the things that Canada are doing that are wrong, human rights abuses, therefore aren't happening. It's the foxes guarding the chickens, with the world's worst tyrannies abusing a legitimate process to deflect attention from their own sordid practices. Now, I would actually agree with this expression, except more when it's actually the foxes that are carrying out the protection, like the United States, Canada, and the UK, who are actually carrying out these kind of human rights abuses across the world, which are actually many, many times worse. We need to look only at the 1.5 million people who've died in Afghanistan. Oh, Afghani people who've died in Afghanistan, which Canada was very much an active participant in. Things like that. Much worse things like the United States, with a combined total of about 3 million dead in Iraq and Afghanistan, just from the actual wars alone. Wars which were based on lies for the benefit of the ruling elite. Yet they seem to think that this is somehow comparable in some way. No matter how much Canada, my own country, wants to stamp its feet and say it didn't do anything wrong and try to point to others, we are still guilty of human rights abuses, no matter how much it may anger our politicians.